Welcome, everyone. I'm your host, Christine Ziegler, CEO of Planet Women. Planet Women is all about building a world where the vibrant diversity of the Earth's people collaborate on equal footing to care for our planet. And Planet Women Presents is all about creating an informal community where we can gather, where all voices are welcome and respected. We exercise compassion and empathy. We seek to understand, not just to respond. And we hope that this provides you with some information that you can actually use, whether it's an inspirational story or a tip or a connection with someone on the call or the speaker themselves. We like to feature people from many generations and backgrounds with lots of different expertise and people who can speak to a variety of topics like gender, like environment and conservation, like management tips and leadership, and many other things. And we want you all to come away with some things that you can take home with you, maybe in your marriage or your relationships with your family, maybe in your communities, things you can apply to your workplace, and to everything about how to just transition from COVID to what comes next. And hopefully we can find out, because Australia is ahead of us in time. So they can tell us what's going on. Are we going to make it? So far, so good. We're here, we're healthy, and we're really grateful to be with all of you today. I want to give a very special welcome to our Planet Women Board of Directors. We have our chair with us today, Karen Poyani. We have Karen is joined by Janet Nguyen and Craig Lesher, Kahea Pacheco, Amira Diamond, and we're really glad to have everyone here today. Thanks, Anya. I also want to acknowledge our Planet Women team. We have our Chief Operating Officer with us, Sela Martinez, who is going to be our version of Oprah today, our Director of Development and Marketing, Joanna Marshall, and our Director of Cultural Transformation, Liza Williams. We will be recording the conversation, so you can share this with friends, and we'll share it with folks who aren't able to join us today. We're going to save quite a bit of time, like 20, 25 minutes for conversation and for questions from the audience. And we're of a size that when we get to that point, you can just unmute yourself and ask questions. Our Zoom jockey for today is our Director of Development and Marketing, Joanna Marshall. If you have any questions and want a private chat with her, she's here for you. And we do beg your forgiveness if anything should go wrong, but nothing ever does, right? It's Zoom, it's perfect. So, and now it is my honor to introduce our special guests. First is Sela Martinez, our Chief Operating Officer. She oversees the infrastructure of Planet Women, which is really important when you're a startup, including the management and thought leadership of our amazing board of directors, implementation of our equity and diversity and inclusion initiatives, figuring out how to hire, how to be transparent, how to have our best practices woven in. And she's partnering with our entire team on our benefits and HR, getting payroll up and running, all those things that you really need. She has more than 25 years experience in the nonprofit sector, working with CEOs and boards and high-level institutions and donors. She's worked at PATH, the Mexican Museum, which used to be at Fort Mason here in San Francisco, and the San Francisco Zoological Society. Most recently, she was with the KIPP Foundation working on education reform, and she was the board secretary, and she worked with the foundation staff. She mentored dozens and dozens of her colleagues on justice and environment and inclusion initiatives. She received her undergraduate degree in Spanish and history from Mills College here in the East Bay of San Francisco, and her master's in Latin American studies from the Monterey Institute of International Studies. She's a native Californian, born and raised here in San Francisco Bay Area, and now she lives in the beautiful Yosemite region in the California foothills of Central California. Sela will be hosting a conversation with the incredible Ariadne Gorring, who is the CEO of the Pollination Foundation, joining us live from Melbourne, Australia. She's passionate about Indigenous-led cultural conservation, working with the Kimberley Land Council for 20 years. So a really great track record there. And she'll tell you a little bit about that move from working in Broome and now in Melbourne. She worked with 14 native title groups to register the West Kimberley on the National Heritage List, but she didn't stop there. She also put together the first of its kind carbon project that is the first in Australia to be registered on native titled lands. So we have a lot to learn from Ari on how might we do that in other places. She's engaged with international, national, and local networks to promote best practices for Indigenous-led conservation. So for example, she was a committee member at the World Indigenous Network Conference in Darwin. She was also a presenter at the World Parks Congress in Sydney. She was there at UNFCCC in Paris for the Paris Climate Accords. She's an Atlantic Fellow for Social Equity, Melbourne University, and very close to many of our hearts who are former employees and current employees of the Nature Conservancy. She is the recipient of the prestigious Barbara Thomas Fellowship in Conservation Financing. Planet Women is certainly honored to know both of you. Thank you for being with us today. Over to you, Sela.
Thank you, Christine. And thanks to all our friends and guests that are joining us today. I know everyone has such busy schedules, so we really appreciate your time today. And thank you, Ari. It's so wonderful to have this time with you to learn about your work, your journey, and all that we can share so that we all grow. As we were preparing for this conversation over the last couple of days, we learned a lot about all the places that you've been and lived and traveled. And you shared with us that there's a lot of places in the world that have shaped who you are. And so we'd love to hear a little bit about how you became the amazing Ari.
Oh, thank you, Sela, and thank you, Christine. What great women we are. Yeah, I'll start by just acknowledging that today I'm here on the lands of the Kulin Nations on Boon Wurrung country in South Melbourne. And in Australia, you know, we really spend a lot of time thinking about and giving our respects to the cultural elders, acknowledging country and the place in which we work and live, and acknowledging the future generations who here in Melbourne and Victoria across the state are negotiating with the state of Victoria to have their rights recognised in a treaty for the benefit of their future generations and all of us who live here. So as well, just acknowledging all of the Indigenous peoples and countries where you all come from around the world. And from an Indigenous perspective, you know, when you meet Indigenous peoples, they always ask, where do you come from? Where were you born? Who's your family? What are your 7 generations back? So I thought it would be a nice way to start this talk, was just to share a little bit about who I am and what shapes me. As you can see down in the left-hand side of the screen there, I had a great time over the weekend pulling out some old photos. That's my parents, my mum, Susanna Cummings, and my dad, Jacob de Hoog. My mum was born in Newcastle, New South Wales, to a coal mining family. My dad was born in Holland, in Delft, and moved to Australia when he was 10. And so has a really interesting story about immigration. But they met at university when university was a place of great ideas and changing the world in the early 70s in Armidale in New South Wales, Australia, and decided to go on a journey into Asia at the time of the Vietnam War. And Dad was going to be a freelance journalist and Mum was teaching English, and very adventurous couple. And they got to Laos and Mum got pregnant. And so they had a ceremony there. I think you can see the photo. Mum's dressing up to have a traditional wedding or a celebration of life because she was pregnant with me. And then they decided that having a baby in Vientiane in the middle of the Vietnam War probably wasn't a good idea, and made a quick move to London. And so I just happened to be born in London in 1972. And at the time it was a place of, you can see a photo there, I'm in the pram. There's a lot of protests happening, you know, what's the wrath of the world to come? And so that was the world that I was born into. What does our future look like? What does it hold for us? after 2 years of living in London, Mum had this kind of romantic dream. I think, you know, a reflection of my name. Ariadne is a Greek mythology name, so she was very much a philosopher. She is a philosopher. And the idea of kind of living in the English countryside didn't really work out in the way that she expected or they expected. And so they moved back to Australia. And I spent most of my childhood growing up in the southwest of Australia in alternative communities. And so in communities where my dad built a house, they owned a property, a cooperative, a group of friends, all seeking new and alternative lifestyles. Dad started up a community school. I spent most of my younger years going to alternative and community schools. And it wasn't until sort of later that I went to more formal education and realised how difficult spelling and maths was. But in those early years was really supported to explore creativity and that deep appreciation of being connected to place and living on country or living on the land and living in community with others. And that took me on a journey to the northwest of Australia, to one of the world's most remote locations, Broome, which is in the Kimberley region. The Kimberley, for a bit of context, is a state the size of California, is a region the size of California with a population of about 40,000 people. So incredible, vast landscapes and a lot of nature. And that's where I spent most of my adult life. And there's a photo of me there with when we had our daughters. All of the women from the community, from Yarra community, would come round and smoke the babies. Our daughters, Sophie and Freya, who both have names from Yarra country, named after senior Aboriginal women. So very much a part of that local community and a part of the family. Yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing.
That's my background.
Love it. Thank you very much for sharing that personal story. And I know you're in Melbourne now, and as Christine said, I'm in Central California near Yosemite. And so fire is a reality that many people face these days and face on a regular basis. So I personally am inspired and excited to learn from you and the initiatives that you're working on. And so we'll start in where you are now in Melbourne. I know it's been about a year ago that you moved from Broome to Melbourne and joined the Pollination Foundation. So we'd love to know about that transition from a different community to a large city, what the mission and vision is of the Pollination Foundation, and any big lessons that you've learned this past year, especially because of COVID.
Lots of big questions in that, Stella. Joe, I reckon you can stop sharing that screen now without me to look at my hippie crazy family. So it was January 2020 that I moved to Melbourne. It was in the midst of huge wildfires here in Southwest Australia. In the Kimberley, my role with the Kimberley Land Council, which is an Indigenous-owned community organisation that is set up for land rights primarily, but a mission to get back country, look after country and get control of the future. And my role there was managing a team of more than 100 Indigenous land and sea managers across the region who were looking after native title lands. And we had built not with a lot of resistance, I have to say, from the state government, cultural fire back into the landscape. And so we had a huge cultural fire operation across the region that was really transforming wildfire and reducing wildfire significantly, and also really empowering Aboriginal people to reignite their traditional knowledge and practices. So when I came to Melbourne in the midst of the wildfires down here, it was a big shock to see how poorly, what impact and devastating impact wildfire does have, but also to be thinking about how can we re-enliven cultural fire practices across the world, because those knowledge systems are really unique and are often overlooked and suppressed. And there is a lot of fear about fire that exists within people. So there's always this kind of response of, we've got to put it out, a bit like Smokey the Bear. There's a fire, quick, put it out. And so one of the good things that came from the fires in Southwest Australia is the re-emergence of a group called Fire Sticks, which is a cultural organisation here in Southwest Australia that's reinvigorating cultural fire practices. So that's a bit about the context of when I got here. It was a really big move. I'd worked for the Kimberley Land Council since I was in my mid-20s, and had grown up with the organisation. And when Martine, who's the founder, one of the founders of Pollination Group, and so Pollination Foundation is nested within a broader group that is focused on the transition to a net zero climate resilient future. And so the group does advisory services to corporates and governments. They're setting up funds to fund the transition, and had this vision to set up a foundation that would really engage with community and elevate community solutions to climate change and innovate in a way that you can't really do in a corporate practice. Right. And so it was a big step for me. I was thinking when I was in Broome, how do I go from, this community organisation that's like family, they've named my children, they've kind of completely claimed me, to this corporate group full of lawyers and advisors and incredibly smart people, and what the hell am I doing in the mix of all of these people? Because at the time I was the only sort of practitioner, I guess, in the group. But what I did find was an incredible community of people who are all just as passionate about changing the world as I am, and all really committed to finding new pathways and doing things differently. And so that's been great to recognise that you can have these major leaps in your life. You can kind of go from one context to another and still feel part of a family and a community, which is really important.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. And is there anything specific from this last year that you learned about in this new role, or that you weren't expecting?
I think one of the things, I wasn't expecting to be locked in a city, coming from the wild, escapes of Broome and going to the beach every day and camping on the beach, and suddenly, walking the suburbs looking for good coffee was completely unexpected. On reflection, I think the time of not being able to travel and get out and reconnect has given us the space to really dig into what is the change that we're really uniquely placed to create in the world. And over the past 12 months, despite the limitations, there's a lot of great projects have found a home within Pollination Foundation, and a lot of great people like Jane, who's with us here today. And so it has been a time where we have all really co-created and dug into what makes us unique, what's the change that we want to be creating. And we've really thought about this idea of, on the one hand, how do we elevate community and community-based solutions, but then also how do we finance that through law, policy, and innovation in new market opportunities. And so having access to Pollination Group and their incredible expertise across the world, and being able to leverage that expertise to look at new policy and legal frameworks, but then also draw on that expertise and invest that into community-based solutions. And so, I'm really passionate about how we all learn together as well as communities. that piece of we're all in this together, we're all really facing these complex challenges. And so how do we learn and co-create together through peer-to-peer learning networks? So the foundation, our strategy or our vision is this idea of place-based economies. How do we embed conservation in local communities? And our mission is to accelerate nature-based initiatives in a way that empowers communities. And we do that through seeding innovation and incubating community solutions, cross-pollinating ideas through peer-to-peer learning, and growing solutions through new market opportunities and looking at policy innovation. And then our last pillar is sharing stories of hope. And how do we share stories in a way that focuses on the transition to a climate resilient future, and share stories that are told by our partners and
Wonderful.
people, communities doing the important work.
Great. And yeah, one of the things that I read a little bit about the Pollination Foundation that I was a concept not familiar to me was about place-based economies. And can you tell us more about that, or how that would work and what that impact might be?
This is inspired by the work that I did in we did in the Kimberley, I should say. There was a big team of us. Really looking at how do we embed conservation in the local economy. So we need to, for me, I see climate change and rapid decline in biodiversity as not as a conservation or a nature issue, as a crisis of humanity. And this idea of how do we actually change the way that we use our natural resources in local economies and value nature in place-based initiatives. And so embedding conservation in local communities through enterprise, through new markets like carbon and biodiversity markets. And a great example of that is that, we have this network of Indigenous ranger groups across the region managing an area the size of California. All of the funds for that work was, the majority of the funding came from government. And we realised how vulnerable we were to the whims of the minister at the time. And so we started thinking about these incredible skills that are being created in community, and how do we create market opportunities or enterprise opportunities to help fund that work. And so things like cultural tourism, huge engagement in research opportunities. So we really got involved with the universities and research sector, and rather than having fly-in researchers, they were engaging local community to deliver a lot of research outcomes. And we built a carbon method through reintroduction of traditional fire management. So by reintroducing traditional fire, you reduce the amount of greenhouse gases because there's not as much smoke going into the atmosphere, so less really hot wildfires, which then reduces greenhouse gas emissions. And so we worked with scientists to design and develop a method that's now registered with the Australian government's emission reduction scheme. And so all of those opportunities start to create a diversified revenue stream that goes directly into community, who are then building up local economies and local business opportunities, and are selling products to local industry. So a lot of the carbon credits were sold to Australian businesses. A lot of the, like I said, the research contractors were with local universities, the tourism was with local providers. And so you start to cycle the money through the local economy.
Wonderful. That's great. Talking a little bit about climate resilience and fire, tell us more about the Women in Fire initiative that is part of the work that you're doing.
So, as I mentioned, the Savanna burning projects, they have transformed Northern Australia, and now across Northern Australia there's 70 Savanna burning projects that are registered, and they are producing about 10% of Australia's emission reductions. And they've created an industry of about $100 million across Northern Australia per year that's flowing directly into Aboriginal communities. So it's transforming the north, and it's transforming the fire regime across the savannas. I think, you know, in some locations, wildfires reduced by 50%. And so we have a vision and are working with the Australian government to adapt that technology for Southern Africa at the moment. And through that work, what we've really noticed is it's always the blokes who are at the forefront of the fire. And fire's, you know, about men, and we have to get out there, and it's really hard work. And what we're noticing across Northern Australia is that the women rangers, the Indigenous women rangers, are like, actually, no, that's not true. We are really effective fire fighters, and it's in women's nature to be really good organisers. And so one of the key parts of the fire work is actually engaging the whole community in a process of planning the fire and the burn, and then, getting out and implementing that fire plan. And so what we've found as we move into Africa as well, again, it's a lot of the men that are involved in the burning work that are making the decisions. And so my passion was, how do we, you know, women get stuff done? How do we inspire and connect more women to be taking leadership roles in fire? And so we've just started an initiative that is connecting local women from here in Australia with women in Botswana, and as well, I think Jackie's here from the WISE Fund. She's funding this work from California, because she reached out to me during the wildfires in California saying, I've heard that you're working on fire and would really love to, you know, look at how we could connect and invest in Indigenous people in California to be really reinvigorating traditional fire management. And so there's a great group called the Cultural Fire Committee in California, and Margot Robbins is leading a lot of that work and has collaborated a lot with the Nature Conservancy, and they are offering training to fire practitioners and bringing people onto country and relearning those cultural fire practices. So yeah, really encourage you all to find out about their work and reach out to them, because it's really making a difference around the world.
Wonderful. Yeah, that's great. Thank you for sharing that. And I know I was near the Creek Fire in California last summer, and everyone is paying attention now because the devastation and the impact of the fires last summer. Very good. Thank you so much for sharing about that initiative and thinking about conservation as a profession and a career, and what you were saying just about how women rangers work in the community. What do you think is the way forward for making the conservation field more inclusive for women and all people?
I was thinking about this a lot. I think one of the most important things in all of our work is diversity, and diversity of perspectives, and how do we create spaces. As I said, you know, conservation is about people. It's about people and people's connection and relationship to nature. And so how do we create spaces where everybody feels like they have a voice? And that's what that's something that I'm really passionate about, is that everybody has something to contribute, everybody has a voice. So how do we, in the design of our initiatives and our processes of how we work every day, create spaces that people feel safe to just say what they're thinking or ask questions and contribute their thoughts and ideas. And one of the ways that traditionally, you know, in the Kimberley, there was always, when we had big gatherings, the space for men's and women's meetings. And that was traditionally, that's a cultural way of kind of creating safe spaces where women can openly share their approaches, their ideas, and then come back together with the men and say, you know, this is what we spoke about, this is our priorities, and then making sure that they're part of, you know, what goes forward and what priorities, who's heard, and what's actioned. And so I think that is also a practice that we can learn from, is, you know, in our meetings, in our spaces, in our gatherings, feel confident about opening up spaces for men and women to talk.
Wonderful. Thank you. I have maybe one or two more questions, and then we'll save time for everyone on the call. When we were chatting last week as we were preparing for this event, you shared that one of your mantras is, you can have a good time changing the world. And I loved that. And it made me so hopeful. And so my question is, what gives you hope and keeps you positive about the future and our planet?
Yeah, it took me a long time to get there, I have to say. The background context to that we can have a good time changing the world was a series of sort of experiences. So it started in the Kimberley, like I said, you know, we were reinvigorating cultural fire management across the region. Aboriginal people were being empowered. They were suddenly generating income from their knowledge and their lands, and the state government did not like that at all, despite having a saying that they wanted to create self-sustaining communities. When we actually started to do it, they felt like they were losing control. And so we had a lot of pushback from agencies and the Premier at the time, who was trying to shut down our fire operations. We were thinking about, you know, racial discrimination cases. It felt like we were kind of really fighting at each, you know, turn to uphold this new model. And it took a lot of energy and a lot of having to hold the space and feel really resistant. And then I was awarded the Atlantic Fellowship and found myself in Rhodes House in Oxford, at Oxford University, with a group of Aboriginal people from Australia and Black South Africans from Cape Town and across South Africa. And we were having this debate about whether or not Rhodes House was an appropriate place to host the Atlantic Institute, given its history of being developed by a coloniser who was very racist. And we were kind of having this tussle and this struggle of, you know, colonisation and decolonising. And I suddenly afterwards went out with my Aboriginal friends and we just laughed and laughed and laughed. And they're really great at kind of creating joy when things get tough. And I had this realisation that oftentimes we get attached to the struggle, and we get so attached and kind of addicted to the struggle of change that it stifles joy. And that actually we can have both. We can have a good time changing the world, and we don't have to be so kind of embedded in the fight for justice. That you can do that and have fun doing it.
That's wonderful. Thank you for sharing that story of that, the origin of that mantra. I'm gonna keep that close to me, because that is there is hard work and there should be joy in that work too. So very good. I think would be at a good point where we can transition to questions from our guests, and we're going to be informal and just unmute yourself and either raise a hand or use the emoji to raise your hand and have you ask your question directly to Ari, so that you can participate. So yeah, anyone ready for a question?
I have a question. Hi.
Yes, Karen.
Thank you so much, Ari, for your work, for joining us today. Well, we do want to change the world for sure. And I love that you have a mantra that there should be joy in that. And that's one of the reasons we formed Planet Women, so that we could have fun doing change work. And one of our program areas in Planet Women is to influence culture of the organizations in the conservation sector beyond Planet Women. So I'm curious, based on your experience, and most of us are from the US and have a very US perspective, what do you think it would be an effective way to kind of spread a change in culture in the other organizations that we all work with and have come from?
One of the ways that we are doing some of that work, and Harry has been doing this with me, is creating peer-to-peer learning networks. And so at the moment, one of the projects we host in the Pollination Foundation is called the Knowledge Network, and it is supporting the BHP Foundation, which is investing in 7 landscape scale projects around the world with multiple partners, TNC and CI, but as well some really small community organisations. And so we have a learning network, and we get together on topics of common interest and just share different approaches and different ideas. And it's like a distributed leadership model, I guess, because it's not just about the leaders within the organisation, it's about the practitioners on the work who are delivering these really complex projects on the ground, and through all scales as well. From everybody's invited to participate in those discussions and to be learning from each other. And, you know, as I said, it's all about people. And so the more we can be investing knowledge and distributing that knowledge through people within organisations and be learning from each other and continuously lifting the bar, the greater we're going to see change happen and outcomes happen. And I think it's really fun doing it too, because you create spaces like this where you feel like, even though you're in different countries around the world, and most of the people that we've been working with, we've never met in person, we still feel this sense of deep connection with each other. And are getting to a point now where we feel really open to ask questions that might feel like they're dumb, but one person asks it and they go, oh yeah, I was thinking about that too, gee, you know. And that's a real barrier, I think, is often people feel like I've got to be the best or the smartest in the room with the biggest idea. And when we do that, we create this barrier to real connection and change.
That's great. Thank you.
Thanks.
I had a question. Hi, I'm Alex. I had a question around what you were mentioning in terms of like men's and women's input. I was meant to do a project last year in Ethiopia around natural resource management, and it was definitely more centered around agricultural resource management. But through our studies before we were supposed to go there, we found that there's a lot of, obviously there's gendered roles within communities. And often when people want to implement kind of gender specific projects within these communities, it's often that women take on more of a men's role, or they're being included by taking on more of a men's role. And that doesn't really happen with the same, men don't take on more of the women's roles. So there's like a tripling, quadrupling of burdens on the women. So I just wanted to know if, through your experiences, if you've ever, dealt with that, if you had any experience in how to kind of improve those kind of things. And yeah.
Yeah, great question, Alex. It's tough, I think, as women step up and take on more leadership roles, their care for community and family, and those responsibilities continue. And in my experience, particularly kind of working in the Kimberley context with communities and seeing women stepping up, it is about creating the space for knowing that they bring those other responsibilities with them, and that is unlikely to change. And so how do you balance the work in a way that somebody can bring their whole self to work and don't have to make choices about, you know, if they spend their time on this activity and feel like then they can't be doing the work with their family. I know that when that's worked well, people have had really strong family systems. And so being able to create strong family systems is important. One of the ways that the community in Northern Australia and the Northern Territory is working to overcome some of these challenges is by asking conservationists to invest in a daycare and in a local community school. And so when the women go to work, they know the kids are safe and they're being looked after and cared for by extended family that are getting paid to do that job. So there's some of the ways that, yeah, communities are sort of overcoming those challenges. But it's tough and it happens all over the world. I think one of the other great learnings that I had recently was as part of the Atlantic Fellowship, it's got learning hubs in universities all over the world. And one of the hubs is in Dublin and it's on brain health and brain research. And we did a masterclass on confident leadership the other day in reflection about how does your brain make decisions. And one of the key findings from the professor, Ian Robinson, was that if you can visualize the change that you want to create and then think about the practical steps that you need to get there, that really helps to reduce, that enables, that's more likely to bring about success than if you think about the steps that you need to take and then visualize what the change would look like. And that women in particular are really great at visualizing the change and then thinking about the steps that need to be taken, and that really reduces the sense of anxiety that you can experience when there's just so much rapid change happening all the time. Yeah, and that's how, kind of what builds confidence from how our brain functions. So that was an interesting finding. It went a bit quick and I didn't get to say why is it particularly for women that, you know, this approach, but something to follow up.
I have another question if no one else is going to ask one. Ari, what has been your own greatest personal challenge in the evolution of your path? And I'm particularly interested in how the transition's been to a .com instead of a .org.
Great question, Karen. I think for me, you know, when I was a kid, for me, growing up, like I shared in the beginning, I spent a lot of time at community schools. When I kind of went to formal education, I used to hide up the back because I didn't really know how to read and write and just pretend that I was doing that until I got found out and kind of went into intensive accelerated learning programs. And so I always had this kind of feeling that I wasn't really smart enough, because that's how the teachers in formal education made me feel. Like, you know, what do you mean you're 11 years old and you don't know how to read and write properly? And so, yeah, there's always been this sense of, you know, am I good enough? Am I educated enough? Am I smart enough to be taking up these kind of leadership roles? Which also on the flip side is really the way that I lead is very much thinking about community and how do we lift people who have incredible creativity and ideas and invest in them. And so working at the Kimberley Land Council was a really great fit for me, because it was with a group of incredible community leaders, a lot of who walked out of the deserts and you know, had first contact experiences and so didn't have formal education as such, but had incredible life experiences. And so I really felt at home with the community in the Kimberley, and they really took me in, and kind of I started as in an admin role in the organisation and went up to be advising the CEO. And so they really invested in each stage of my leadership and stepping me up when they knew I was ready to take on more challenges and more roles. And so real sense of family and family within that community, and recognition that leadership goes beyond formal education. And so that has been a real gift. And so stepping into a .com and setting up the foundation, when I first came in, like I said, I was like, how did I end up here with all these amazing people that, you know, have accelerated learning and all come from really privileged backgrounds and have done huge amounts of, you know, interesting education and all have master's degrees. And but what I found also within the organisation is a group of really passionate people that want to change the world and are really interested in diverse perspectives, and are really interested in how do we empower communities, and knowing that this transition to a climate resilient future does require diversity of perspectives and ideas, and that is really critical, and so have really kind of found my voice in that space too, and realize the skills that I bring that are really different thinking and how important those different perspectives are.
That's so awesome and inspiring. Thank you for sharing that.
Thanks.
Yeah, hi Ari, this is Hank Colley. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, I can. Hi, Hank.
Yeah, how you going? I loved your introduction story and the long piece there about your friends and your development, your pathway. It was very, very interesting. So well done on that. My question is, so we're working partly in the United States. We're starting to work with Native Americans here, and then we have a big project starting with First Nations up in Canada, especially in the Northwest Territories. And we'll be doing some fire work up there with the Guardians, the Canadian Guardian work. So two-part question. Have you done work with Canadians on fire management with women in Canada through the Guardians program? And then second part of the question is, whether you have or not, what advice would you give us for starting such an initiative that is sure to include women in the proper way?
Haven't yet worked in Canada, but I do have friends that are working in Canada reigniting cultural fire, and I will find they've got a great video of a cultural burn that was done a few years ago. One of the ways that they approached that, and that's in BC, was by bringing a cultural fire practitioner from Australia to the community and working with the community to kind of reinvigorate their knowledge and refine their knowledge, because in a lot of places, knowledge of cultural fire has been quite suppressed, and people, it's not until somebody comes, it's like bringing a spark. Somebody comes with a spark and helps to undig and blow and build that knowledge system back up. And so that has been really powerful. And I know that Margot in the York tribe from California has also been sharing and building out networks across California and into Canada through the Nature Conservancy and Nature United. So those bringing people who are strong in their cultural fire knowledge to be sharing their knowledge with the community and working with them to reinvigorate that knowledge and bring the elders back in a way that they feel confident to share is really important first step. And making sure that there's, like I said, spaces for men and women. So one of the ways that we've done that in Botswana with the project is we've had a community researcher, and she has gone out and talked to the elders in her community and sat down and had a cup of tea with them and talked about you know, what's there, what did fire look like in the past? And she's done that with people individually and then brought that all together in a report that's been shared back to the community. And that's ensured that men's and women's voices have been heard in that process. So that's really important. But, you know, we took a group of rangers from Northern Australia into Botswana when we were travelling in 2009, and it was incredible to watch how the knowledge of fire practitioners from Northern Australia could be applied in the Botswanan landscape, and how that actual demonstration got people talking a lot and got people, you know, remembering their knowledge systems. And that is really, those points of connection are really important.
Thank you, Ari. Thank you for sharing.
I have a question if we can accommodate one more.
Yes, you will be our last question. Thank you so much.
Okay, right. So Ari, thank you for sharing. I'm curious, you know, when you were making the big change or even throughout your life, who were your mentors? Who were you getting support from?
Great question. Anya, nice to meet you. A lot of the support, and there's a great photo actually, Jojo, now's a really nice time to show it, of me sitting with a group of women in the Kimberley. So a lot of my mentoring and support came from Aboriginal women, and from that kind of really grassroots level, and always regrounding and talking with them about, these are some of the ideas that I have, this is what I'm thinking, and hearing their perspectives has been a big part of that journey. And then I had the opportunity when I did the Atlantic Fellowship for an executive coach, and that really accelerated my confidence and my learning. And through that process, really understanding how important it is to know yourself and know your journey and understand how you show up in the world as being really critical. So that really accelerated my leadership, was having access. And at the time, you know, coming from the NGO sector, we all laughed about that. Like, oh, we've got the executive coach. That's something that you do, you know, like a kind of corporate leader. But highly recommend having access to people like that to support your journey, because it really made a difference.
Thank you so much. Thank you for all the great questions. And I'm going to pass it to my teammate, Jojo.
Yes. Oh, that was so wonderful, Ari. When you were speaking at the second to last question, you said something about rekindling the knowledge and how people are actually able to remember and relearn some of this historical knowledge that has been lost. And it was reminding me of an event we did a couple weeks ago where we had a Quechua woman, Marcela Machaca, who does, she's a water protector in the high country in Peru. And she said to me, and I just put this in our newsletter that went out today, we've forgotten how to listen to nature, but that we can relearn how to do that. And she made a joke about the fact that she went to get her an engineering degree, and she was like, this science is a hoax, frankly, and like, you don't need it. We can do this just with our natural knowledge that's inside of us, which I didn't put in the newsletter, but I agree. So also a nod to the formal education. So just to close, I want to say thank you both, Sela and Ari. This was so juicy and wonderful. I'm really, really thrilled that you could be here. And we will send out an email afterwards with the recording, as well as some resources that Ari will provide with more info. And that will include a link to a survey to give feedback. However, we know that nobody likes to do surveys, and really they don't happen. So we thought we would close with a little activity. If you could put in the chat a rose and a thorn, so something that you loved and something that you felt could use improvement. It could be also an intention if you sort of were, something came up for you in the talk that you want to share. We would love to have your voice. So instead of having everybody shout at once, we thought maybe you could do it in the chat. So we have 3 minutes if you would like to do that with us.
And thank you, Sela and Jojo and Christine, for having me. Yeah, great to be able to share that story.
My pleasure.
Ari, while people are doing this, I wanted to note, I love the way that you say care for country. The way that you use that phrase for country or being on country is unique. I haven't heard that before. We don't phrase it that way in the US. And I was wondering who uses that? Is that common in Australia, or is that more of an Indigenous phrasing?
It is very much an Indigenous phrasing. Country is everything. And so country kind of is your land or your place. And so country is used because people are connected to sea country as much as they are to land and landscapes, and to water and rivers. So it takes in, and to the, and to the sky. And particularly there's a lot of stories and connection with the Milky Way. And so that idea and notion of country is that it's all encompassing. And so people have very strong connections to the places where they come from and originate from.
That's beautiful.
Yeah. And yeah, I did go on to go to university and get degrees and do all that.
It's nice to have both.
Oh, I'm with the woman from Peru. I think I learned more from my land experience than I did from university. Yeah.
I mean, it's nice to have both. You learn the rules and then you can break them. All right, everyone. Well, we are at time. So thank you so much for being here. We are going to continue doing these Planet Women Presents. And if you haven't already signed up for our newsletter, I'm actually just going to put that in the chat because that is where we send out invites. Actually, I'll just put our website in so you can have that. And I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your week. Feel free to unmute yourself and say hey and goodbye.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Jojo.
Thank you.
Great.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you.